A very good evening to all dignitaries and friends gathered here on this wonderful day, the World Water Day, when the entire world reflects on water-related issues and inspires others also to take action and make a difference. Today, Asset Homes conducts the 18th edition of their triannual lecture series on sustainable development, Beyond Square Feet. The series was inaugurated on June 5th, 2015, the World Environment Day by Padma Shri architect G. Shankar. Today, on World Water Day, I express my heartiest welcome to you all to an interesting and informative evening of delving into the various issues and alternative solutions of sustainable management of water resources. World Water Day, as per United Nations, is an international observance and an opportunity to learn more about water-related issues, be inspired to tell others and take action to make a difference. Today, we have here with us the architect of the future, Sri Siddharth Menon. On behalf of Asset Homes, SEMS Group of Educational Institutions, Greenstone Foundation, and SEMS Water Institute, I welcome the leaders of the industry and other walks of life who are here to listen to him and to reflect on the current state of the urban water resources and the positive changes we can possibly make for a better future. അന്താരാഷ്ട്ര ജലദിനം, പരിസ്ഥിതി ദിനം, ഭൗമദിനം എന്നീ 3 ദിനങ്ങളിലായി വർഷം തോറും അസറ്റ് ഹോംസ് സംഘടിപ്പിച്ചു വരുന്ന ബിയോണ്ട് സ്ക്വയർ ഫീറ്റ് എന്ന പ്രഭാഷണ പരമ്പരയിലെ 18ാമത് പതിപ്പിന് ഇന്നിവിടെ തുടക്കമാവുകയാണ്. ജലം അമൂല്യമാണ്, അത് ജീവൻ്റെ ആധാരമാണ്. അന്താരാഷ്ട്ര ജലദിനമായ ഇന്ന് ശുദ്ധജലത്തിൻ്റെ ദൗർലഭ്യത, അത് ഉയർത്തുന്ന വെല്ലുവിളികൾ, ഇതിനുള്ള പരിഹാര മാർഗങ്ങൾ ഇവയെല്ലാം ഇന്നിവിടെ ചർച്ചയ്ക്ക് വിധേയമാകുന്നു. ഇത്തവണ അസറ്റ് ഹോംസിനോടൊപ്പം ഈ മഹനീയ സംരംഭത്തിൽ കൈകോർക്കുന്നത് കേരളത്തിലെ പ്രമുഖ വിദ്യാഭ്യാസ സ്ഥാപനമായ SEMS ഗ്രൂപ്പാണ്. ജലത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രാധാന്യം ഉൾക്കൊണ്ട് ഇതിനായി ഒരു പ്രത്യേക റീസർച്ച് ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂട്ട് തന്നെ SEMS സ്ഥാപിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട് എന്നത് ഈ വിഷയത്തെ എത്ര ഗൗരവത്തോടെ അവർ നോക്കിക്കാണുന്നു എന്നതിന് തെളിവാണ്. ഏവരെയും ഹൃദയപൂർവ്വം ഒരിക്കൽ കൂടി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുകയാണ്. Ladies and gentlemen, and now we have a short AV on Asset Homes and our journey so far. Kindly watch the screen.
Welcome to Kerala, Gold's own country, the lands of assets.
Kerala is now the land of assets. Over the years, with projects across all major cities in Kerala, Asset Homes has made it so. Along with hundreds of Keralites from across the world, I too am a proud owner of an asset. When it comes to owning a home, today Asset Homes is Kerala's first choice.
A seed was sown in 2007. It grew, nurturing relationships to spread its shade of responsibility known as Nanma Maram. The asset value tree is rooted in 4 unfailing values: prompt delivery, total quality, customer centricity, and societal responsibility. I believe, like justice, a home delayed is a home denied. I received my asset on time, and so did all others. Asset Homes is the first and youngest builder in Kerala to complete 58 projects in 12 years since inception. Spanning from Thiruvananthapuram to Kannur, they stand as testimonies to Asset Homes' promise of prompt delivery.
From food to home decor, I'm a stickler for quality. Because whatever is of high quality lasts, like my Asset Home.
Their uncompromising commitment to quality made Asset Homes the youngest builder in India to receive CRISIL DA2 Plus rating in just 12 years. Asset Homes is also the first and only builder in India to receive CRISIL 7-star rating for 3 residential projects.
I maintain my work-life balance. The Asset Delight team keeps me absolutely tension-free. They help me fetch my grocery, pay my bills, you name it.
Asset Homes'ന്റെ കസ്റ്റമേഴ്സിന് Asset Homes'ന്റെ ഡിലൈറ്റ് സർവീസ്.
Asset Delight is a bouquet of 17 unique services to the customer, including 25 years free insurance coverage for the apartments and villas, free transit home facility, and many more to ensure that the residents have a comfortable and convenient lifestyle. Founded by a technocrat, V. Sunil Kumar, Asset Homes is led by an eminent board of directors. The company is run by a team of professional leaders and closely guided by an advisory board. The true asset of Asset Homes is the dedicated employees. Together, they have won laurels for the company, including national and international awards and recognitions.
നാം ഓരോരുത്തർക്കും വീട് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് നമ്മുടേതായ ഒരു ചെറിയ പ്രപഞ്ചം തന്നെയാണ്. അസറ്റ് ഹോംസിനെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം ഓരോ നിർമ്മിതിയുടെയും തത്വശാസ്ത്രം അതിൻ്റെ വില കൽപ്പിക്കുന്ന സ്ക്വയർ ഫീറ്റുകൾക്കും അപ്പുറത്താണ്. നമ്മുടെ നാട്ടിലെ നിയമങ്ങളോടും പ്രകൃതിയോടും സഹജീവികളോടും ഉത്തരവാദിത്തമുള്ളവരായിരിക്കുക എന്നതുപോലെ തന്നെ വളരെയേറെ പ്രാധാന്യമുള്ള ഒന്നാണ് ഓരോ ഉപഭോക്താവിൻ്റെ താല്പര്യങ്ങളോടും ഉത്തരവാദിത്തമുള്ളവരായിരിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളത്. അസറ്റ് ഹോംസ് വിശ്വസിക്കുന്ന ഏറ്റവും ലഘുവായ പ്രത്യയശാസ്ത്രവും ഇതുതന്നെയാണ്.
ഇവൾക്ക് ശക്തി പകരാം, പ്രകൃതിയെ ഉർവരമാക്കാം, ഒരു തേക്കിൻ തൈ നടാം ഓരോ മകൾക്കും വേണ്ടി. Yes, the only tree of trust in the land of assets. Asset, responsibly yours.
Asset Homes, responsibly yours. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Presently, let me request Mr. Sunil Kumar V., founder and managing director of Asset Homes, to formally welcome the dignitaries and guests. A trained engineer with a vision and determination, he has taken Asset Homes to greater heights. Welcome, sir.
ബഹുമാനപ്പെട്ട ശ്രീ മോഹൻചേട്ടൻ, ശ്രീ പ്രമോദ്, ആദരണീയരായ വിശിഷ്ടാതിഥികളെ, ബഹുമാനരായ ശ്രോതാക്കളെ, ഇന്ന് മാർച്ച് 22 ലോക ജലദിനമാണ്. 700 കോടിയോളം വരുന്ന മാനവ സമൂഹത്തിൻ്റെ ജീവൽ സ്വപ്നങ്ങൾക്ക് നനവ് നൽകുന്ന ജലത്തിൻ്റെ പേരിൽ ഒരു ദിവസം. ഈ ഭൂമിയിലെ ഓരോ ജീവഗണത്തിൻ്റെയും നിലനിൽപ്പ് തന്നെ ജലം എന്ന 2 അക്ഷരങ്ങളിലാണ് എന്ന തിരിച്ചറിവ് നമുക്കുണ്ടാവേണ്ടിയിരിക്കുന്നു എന്ന് നമ്മളെ ബോധ്യപ്പെടുന്ന ദിവസം. ഇന്ന് ഈ സായം സന്ധ്യയിൽ അസറ്റ് ഹോംസിൻ്റെ ബിയോണ്ട് സ്ക്വയർ ഫീറ്റ് എന്ന പ്രഭാഷണ പരമ്പരയുടെ 18ാമത്തെ എഡിഷൻ ഏകദേശം ഒരു കൊല്ലമായിട്ട് കഴിഞ്ഞ 2 എഡിഷനുകൾ ഞങ്ങൾ ഓൺലൈനിലാണ് നടത്തിയത്. കാരണം ഫിസിക്കലായിട്ടുള്ള മീറ്റിങ്ങുകൾക്ക് സാധിച്ചിരുന്നില്ല. വീണ്ടും ഫിസിക്കൽ മീറ്റിംഗ് സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്തതിൻ്റെ ഒരു തുടക്കം ഈ SCMSലെ മനോഹരമായിട്ടുള്ള ഈ ഹോളിൽ വെച്ച് ആരംഭിക്കാൻ സാധിച്ചിട്ടുള്ള സന്തോഷവും ആഹ്ലാദവും ചാരിതാർത്ഥ്യവും ആത്മനിർവൃതിയും എല്ലാം നിങ്ങളോടൊപ്പം ഞാൻ പങ്കുവയ്ക്കാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുകയാണ്. വീണ്ടും ഒരു ഫിസിക്കൽ മീറ്റിംഗ് തുടങ്ങുന്ന സമയത്ത് അത് ആരുമായിട്ട് ചേർന്നിട്ടാവണമെന്ന് ആലോചിച്ചപ്പോൾ ആദ്യം വന്ന പേര് SCMSൻ്റെയാണ്. കാരണം ജല ഉപഭോഗവുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടിട്ടും കുടിവെള്ളത്തിൻ്റെ ലഭ്യതയെപ്പറ്റിയുമെല്ലാം വളരെ കൃത്യമായിട്ടുള്ള ബോധത്തോടു കൂടി ചില പ്രവർത്തനങ്ങൾ നടത്തുന്ന ഒരു സ്ഥാപനം എന്നുള്ള നിലയിൽ SCMSനെ വളരെ നേരത്തെ തന്നെ ഞങ്ങൾ നോക്കിക്കാണുകയുണ്ടായി. അപ്പോൾ അത്തരമൊരു സ്ഥാപനവുമായി സഹകരിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ഒപ്പം തന്നെ പരിസ്ഥിതിയുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട വിഷയങ്ങളിൽ വലിയ ചലനങ്ങൾ സൃഷ്ടിക്കുന്ന ഈ നമ്മുടെ പുറകിലിരിക്കുന്ന പടം തന്നെ അതിന് തെളിവാണ്. ഗ്രീൻ സ്റ്റോം ഫൗണ്ടേഷനുമായെല്ലാം ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടുകൊണ്ട് അവരുടെ എല്ലാം സഹകരണത്തോടെ ഇന്ന് 18ാമത്തെ എഡിഷൻ ഇവിടെ നടക്കുകയാണ്. നമ്മുടെ ശരീരത്തിലെ ഓരോ അവയവവും പോലെ ആവണം നമുക്ക് പ്രകൃതിയും. നമ്മുടെ കണ്ണും കൈയും എത്ര കരുതലോടെ നമ്മൾ സംരക്ഷിക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ആവണം പ്രകൃതിയോടും നമ്മളോടുള്ള സമീപനം. വളരെ എടുത്തു പറയേണ്ട ഒരു പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട കാര്യം ഈ കോവിഡ് സാഹചര്യങ്ങൾക്കിടയിൽ പോലും ഈ ഹോളിൽ നിറഞ്ഞിരിക്കുന്ന ഒരു ജനസമൂഹത്തെ പറ്റിയിട്ടാണ്. കാരണം ഇത്തരമൊരു സാഹചര്യത്തിൽ പോലും ജലമെന്ന് പറയുന്ന അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പരിസ്ഥിതി എന്ന് പറയുന്ന വളരെ കോംപ്ലിക്കേറ്റഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ളൊരു വിഷയത്തെ എത്രത്തോളം ആകുലരാണ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ എത്രത്തോളം ആശങ്കയുള്ളവരാണ് നമ്മളെല്ലാവരും എന്നുള്ളതിൻ്റെ പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട തെളിവാണ് ഇന്ന് ഈ ഹോളിലെ എല്ലാ സീറ്റുകളും നിറഞ്ഞിരിക്കുന്നു എന്നുള്ള വസ്തുത. നമുക്കറിയാം, പ്രകൃതിയിലെ സർവ്വചരാചരങ്ങളെയും സകല വിഭവങ്ങളെയും ആദരിക്കുകയും സംരക്ഷിക്കുകയും പൂജിക്കുകയും ചെയ്തിരുന്ന ഒരു മഹത്തായ സംസ്കാരത്തിൻ്റെ പിൻതലമുറക്കാരാണ് നമ്മൾ. ആ നിലയ്ക്ക് ജലം പോലും ഭാരതീയർ പൂജിച്ചിരുന്ന ഒരു വസ്തുവാണ്. ആ സംസ്കൃതിയെ നിലനിർത്തുക എന്നുള്ളതും അത്തരമൊരു വിചാരം വരും തലമുറയിലേക്ക് പകർന്നു കൊടുക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതും ഓരോ ഭാരതീയൻ്റെയും കടമയാണെന്ന് കൂടി ഞങ്ങൾ വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നു. അസറ്റ് ഹോംസിനെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം ഓരോ ഉപഭോക്താവിനോടും ഓരോ തൊഴിലാളിയോടും ഓരോ പ്രൊജക്റ്റിനോടും നാട്ടിൽ നിലവിലുള്ള നിയമങ്ങളോടും സമൂഹത്തോടാകെ തന്നെയും റെസ്പോൺസിബിളായിരിക്കുക എന്ന അടിസ്ഥാന പ്രമാണത്തിൻ്റെ ഭാഗമാണ് പ്രകൃതിയോടും റെസ്പോൺസിബിളായിരിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളത്. ഏത് അടിസ്ഥാന വിശ്വാസത്തിൻ്റെ കാര്യത്തിലായാലും പ്രവർത്തനത്തിൻ്റെ കാര്യത്തിലായാലും ഒപ്പം വേണ്ട ഒരു പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട കാര്യമാണ് പ്രഭാഷണങ്ങളും എന്ന് ഞങ്ങൾ കരുതുന്നു. ചിന്താശകലങ്ങൾ സംരക്ഷണം ചെയ്യപ്പെടുമ്പോൾ സംഭവിക്കുന്നത് ആശയങ്ങളുടെ വിലയിരുത്തലുകളാണ്. ഒരു നല്ല പ്രഭാഷകൻ്റെ ഓരോ വാക്കും ഓരോ വരിയും ഒരു വലിയ ആഹ്വാനമാണ്. ഇന്നീ വേദിയിൽ നിന്ന് ഉയരുന്ന ഒരു വാചകമെങ്കിലും ഇവിടെ കൂടിയിരിക്കുന്ന ഒരു മനുഷ്യനെയെങ്കിലും സ്വാധീനിക്കാൻ കഴിഞ്ഞു എന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അത് ഈ പ്രയത്നം എത്രത്തോളം ഗുണകരമായി എന്നുള്ളതിൻ്റെ തെളിവായിട്ട് ഞങ്ങൾ കണക്കാക്കുകയാണ്. ബിയോണ്ട് സ്ക്വയർ ഫീറ്റ് എന്ന പദം ഒരു നിർമ്മാതാവ് ഉച്ചരിക്കുമ്പോൾ അതിൻ്റെ വിശദീകരണം ആവശ്യമില്ലാതാവുകയാണ്. കാരണം അതെല്ലാ അർത്ഥത്തിലും ആ വാചകത്തിൻ്റെ പൂർണ്ണമായിട്ടുള്ള അന്തസത്ത ഉൾക്കൊണ്ടുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെയാണ് അസറ്റ് ഹോംസ് ഇത്തരം പ്രോഗ്രാമുകൾ സംഘടിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. വർഷത്തിൽ 3 തവണയാണ് ബിയോണ്ട് സ്ക്വയർ ഫീറ്റ് എന്നുള്ള പേരിൽ അസറ്റ് ഹോംസ് ഈ പ്രോഗ്രാം സംഘടിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. അത് വേൾഡ് എൻവയോൺമെൻറ്റ് ഡേ, വേൾഡ് ഹാബിറ്റാറ്റ് ഡേ, വേൾഡ് വാട്ടർ ഡേ എന്നീ 3 ദിവസങ്ങളിലാണ്. ടുഡേ we have with us a great personality, architect Siddharth Menon, a traveling architect and a geographer who was here to address us on socio-economic inequality, ecological and cultural degradation. He is also a doctoral candidate in geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, USA. He specializes in urban and regional studies, international development, politics and ecology, science and technology. With a lot of pride and respect, I take this opportunity to extend a warm welcome to our dear speaker, Sri Siddharth Menon, to this august audience. ഏറെ ആദരവോടെ ഇവിടെ എത്തിച്ചേർന്നിരിക്കുന്ന എറണാകുളത്തെ ഈ പ്രമുഖ പൗരാവലിയെയും SCMS കോളേജുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട് പ്രവർത്തിക്കുന്ന മുഴുവൻ വ്യക്തികളെയും, ഗ്രീൻ സ്റ്റോം ഫൗണ്ടേഷൻ്റെ പ്രവർത്തകരെയും, ക്രഡായി ഭാരവാഹികളെയും, ഒപ്പം തന്നെ മുഴുവൻ ശ്രോതാക്കളെയും അഭ്യുദയകാംക്ഷികളെയും ഹൃദയത്തിൻ്റെ ഭാഷയിൽ ഞാൻ സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. ബിയോണ്ട് സ്ക്വയർ ഫീറ്റിൻ്റെ തുടർന്നുള്ള എഡിഷനുകളിലേക്കും നിങ്ങളുടെ ഏവരുടെയും ആത്മാർത്ഥമായ സഹകരണം പ്രതീക്ഷിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ സ്വാഗതം ഉപസംഹരിക്കുന്നു. നന്ദി, നമസ്കാരം.
Thank you, sir. Today, we are fortunate to have architect Siddharth Menon, an economic and urban geographer and architect of the future, as our guest speaker. Currently a PhD candidate in geography with a PhD minor in science and technology studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, architect Menon is also affiliated with the Whole Center for Science and Technology Studies, Center for South Asia, and the Center for Culture, History, and Environment. Siddharth received his bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Mumbai in 2011 and master's degree in geography with a graduate certificate in development studies from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2018. Between 2011 and 2016, he worked as an architect in India. His doctoral dissertation research highlights the imbalances between dominant narratives of economic growth through infrastructure construction in rapidly developing second-tier cities in India, like Kochi, and the social and environmental consequences of such urban development trajectories. His research interests include economic and urban geography, political ecology, development studies, science and technology studies, and built environment with respect to South Asia in general and Kerala in particular. His teaching interests are in international development, urban studies, environmental politics, science and technology studies, architecture, and environmental design, qualitative research methods, etc. Today, on the 18th edition of Beyond Square Feet, architect Siddharth Menon will talk to us on the theme Valuing Water, Water Scarcity, and Inequality in its Distribution and its Structural Causes. Sir, may I call upon you to enlighten us with your insights. Let's welcome architect Siddharth Menon to the dais with a round of applause.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Siddharth Menon, and I'm a PhD candidate in geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I study India's economic and urban development trajectories and the various kinds of economic, social, and environmental inequalities that they produce. I don't know if I'm an architect of the future, like I've been introduced right now, but definitely I'd like to think of myself as an architect of the present. In my past life as a practicing architect, I've lived and worked in different parts of rural India, trying to use my architecture skills to address deep-rooted socio-economic development issues. Here, I've primarily worked in Himachal Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Telangana, and built community centers for non-profit organizations with the help of traditional craftspeople, using locally sourced materials like mud, bamboo, wood, and stone. Today, on the occasion of UN World Water Day, I'm grateful to Mr. Sunil Kumar for inviting me to speak at the 18th edition of the Beyond Square Feet lecture series. I've traveled extensively across India and the world, and I must admit that there aren't too many instances of a developer actively sponsoring and promoting a critical forum on sustainable development. So I think this space is quite unique, and I commend Mr. Sunil Kumar for conceptualizing it and supporting it. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Mr. Xavier of Asset Homes for organizing all the logistics for this event, and to Sri Priya for the kind introduction. When I was first asked to speak about water in the built environment, I was in a dilemma. I thought to myself, how should I speak about such an everyday topic? Water is ubiquitous. It is inside us, it is around us, it's in the air we breathe, it's in the food we eat. It is the most abundantly used natural resource in the world. Water is basically everywhere. And as trained architects, and I'm sure there are a few architects in the room, we've been trained to think about water and architecture in very familiar ways. I could begin the lecture by showing you some sleek images of water in architecture from prominent architects in India. For example, this is a LEED Platinum and GREEAFI certified corporate office for a wind turbine manufacturer in Pune. It's been dubbed as one of the greenest corporate campuses in the world. by Christopher Charles Benninger, who actually was at this forum a few years ago. So a really good architect and some really good work incorporating water into the built environment. Another example would be the new IIM Ahmedabad campus by HCP Design. Now, if you remember, recently there was a lot of controversy with some of the older buildings at IIM Ahmedabad, which the iconic buildings designed by Louis Kahn, which were said to be demolished by the administration. An important side note is HTP is also involved in the reconstruction of the Central Vista project in New Delhi. And that's also another controversial kind of project which has been taken up by the central government there. Or I could show you the sleek rendering of the Amravati Legislative Assembly building, designed by world-renowned Norman Foster and partners, along with our very own Hafiz contractor from Bombay, who, by the way, is one of the largest architecture firms in the country, employing more than 500 architects, engineers, draftsmen, all under one shop. So these are the first images that come to mind when one thinks about water and architecture, because that's how we've been trained to think about it. Especially as architects, that's what we've been training our students to also think about how to incorporate water into the built environment. But, and there's always a but, for 2/3 of the Earth's population, these images are not the reality. They're dreams, they're aspirations, they're probably part of their imagination, they're something that they see from afar, but they cannot touch and feel it. For those 2/3 of the Earth's population, the everyday reality of water and the built environment is this, a classic example of a jhopatpatti. It's a Marathi word used for slum or informal settlement. Of course, Dharavi being the biggest example, Bombay, but there are many more informal, actually 60% of Bombay is informal settlements or jhopatpattis. If you look at Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, you have kampungs. Again, this is a city which is about to go underwater. The government that is actively trying to relocate the capital to a different place due to rising high levels of seawater levels. And again, the majority of Jakarta's population lives in these kind of informal settlements along the water banks. Or we could think about Lagos in Nigeria, in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, a majority of the population living in this informal Makako floating slum. And while in developing countries like India, Indonesia, and Nigeria, these kind of images are not an exception. You cannot call these things, these are just something that you might find along the way. This is basically an everyday living part of life. This is the norm of it. Now, both these sets of images, the first three that I showed you of architecture and water, and the last three that I showed you of informality and water, are connected to access to water, inequality related to water. Yet the first set of images are the ones that really come to mind. The last three sets of images are the ones we kind of keep it in the back parts of our mind, not really thinking about it too much. I'm interested in exploring the latter three sets of questions. Now, the problem of water and scarcity is so acute that the United Nations is working with national governments to ensure that access to clean water and sanitation becomes a basic human fundamental right. It is part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals 2030, through which they hope to leave no one behind and make sure that all the material wealth, all the economic growth that's taking place in the world, we can make sure that every person in this world has access to clean drinking water. Yet we've seen in the set of images that I just showed you, gross inequalities exist at the global scale, which are now being compounded by socio-natural disasters like the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to show you a map right now, and since I'm a geographer, I love maps, so there's going to be a lot of maps in this talk, so please pay attention to them because there's a common theme running through all of them. Now, this is the distribution, I hope this is clear, but this is basically the distribution of water along the world, per capita usage of water. As you can see, some of the most places which use the most amount of water are, as you can guess, North America, Europe, and Australia, while the places that don't consume as much water are the lesser developed regions of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa particularly, also South Asia, also Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America. The next map, this shows the global water scarcity. And the funny thing to note that those regions that in the previous map were consuming the most amount of water are not the ones really facing water scarcity. It's again the places that do not use water are the ones that are facing water scarcity. And these are also the regions that are within the tropics, which are blessed with abundant resources of fresh water, rain-fed rivers, etc., right? Parts of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of South Asia. Spend some time looking at this graphic because there's a common theme of inequality or global inequality running throughout this, which will be coming up throughout the lecture. And that's the question I want to explore for the next 20 minutes is, what are the structural processes that produce these kind of global inequalities in the built environment, and particularly related to water? So what we're going to do is, over the next 20 or 20 odd minutes, I'm going to take you through a journey across space and time, try to kind of pinpoint and explore what macro structural processes are giving rise to these kinds of inequalities, and what we can do about it collectively. But the first thing to do before you really jump into it is to understand the meaning of development. Now, this is a word that gets thrown around a lot these days, right? There's urban development, there's economic development, there's rural development, there's sustainable development, there's human development, there's social development. But what is development? If you were to deconstruct the word and go back to its root causes, what do we mean by development? Where did it come from? And here, critical development scholar Gillian Hart is useful to think with, right? She points out that development can be split into two parts. One is little d development, and the second is big D development. By little d development, she basically speaks about the development of capitalism as a set of historical processes. So capitalism being the idea to grow the economy through a completely capital system. And big D development is a unique set of interventions in the third world which took place after World War II. So if you were to look at little d development first, now again, I mean, I shouldn't be standing here lecturing anyone in Kerala about when did capitalism start, because I think most of you all are well grained in it. But there's a common understanding that the history of capitalism, genesis of it would be in the Industrial Revolution, particularly in England in the 1800s. That's, of course, when Marx was also writing. And he would definitely argue that that's what the case is there. However, recent scholarship by economic historians has forced us to contend with the fact that it wasn't the Industrial Revolution that was the genesis of the capitalist economic system. You need to go further back a couple of centuries to the genesis of colonization and empire, in particularly the discovery of the New World. These are the Americas, of course, in the 1500s, 1496 to be precise, when the first European sailors arrive on the American continent. And this kind of settler colonialism that takes place there. I'll get into that in detail, but introduction to a couple of other scholars who really help with trying to understand what's happening with kind of the history of capitalism here. One scholar, a personal favorite of mine, David Harvey on the left, is a Marxist economic geographer. And he uses this term called the spatial fix. Basically what he argues that capital always is in need of further spaces to expand to. It has inherent contradictions, and the only way it can get out of those contradictions, which can become crises, are by expanding to new spaces. Rosa Luxemburg, who's a Polish economist, who's writing much before Harvey, also concurs with this point. And she makes a key interjection here, is that not only is capital about expansion into new space, but also that colonialism, imperialism are directly connected to it. The reason traders from Europe went around the world looking for new worlds, thinking it's India, going to North America, calling them Red Indians, thought they had found India. The reason for that is because they needed new markets to sell their commodities, new markets to extract resources from. And this is true, because if you look at the history of the New World, I mean, you have to go back to plantation economies. So the American South in particular is known for its huge plantations of cotton, sugarcane. All of it was possible only on the backs of slave labor. And this, another map here kind of explains that point very well. This is from Sven Becker's Empire of Cotton. Basically, if you look at the colonial trade maps of the British East Indian Empire in the 1800s, you look at all the trade that's happening there, and there are a few places that really stand out. One, of course, is the northern part of England. These are where the mills of Manchester and London, the factories of London were. The second part, you can see the blue lines there, are the western coast of Africa. This is where traders went in, bought African slaves. They shipped, and these were like cattle or commodities, right? You're buying and selling human beings. You ship them to the east coast of the United States. That's where you're sold to plantation owners to work on cotton farms and to work on sugarcane farms, etc. Raw material from those plantations are then shipped back to the motherland, this being England. They are worked upon by sweatshop workers in London and Manchester to make consumer items, to make products, which are then taken back to other parts of the colony, particularly Southern Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and sold to people like us as part of the colonial empire. This is after the British systematically also dismantled India's indigenous handicraft industry, the handlooms, etc., etc. So we were forced to buy all of the products which were then being made by laborers in Manchester. Why blame only Britain? In the 1900s, the whole world was divided into small colonies of a few handful of European states, right? So you had Belgium, the Danes, you had the Netherlands, you had Germany, you had Italy. All of these countries had small pockets. Of course, the British Empire was the most powerful and the largest of them all, and India had a key place in that. And to make this point even clearer, you need to just go back to Angus Maddison, who's an economic historian who did some pioneering work in terms of drawing out statistical data over the past 400 years. His main argument is that in the 1600s, China and India were actually some of the most richest countries in the world. And remember, when I say countries, I mean it in a very loose sense. India as a political unit wasn't established until 1947. I'm talking about the areas of India and China. So if you look at their share in the GDP, they're in 1600s roughly 22% and 29%. After 300 years of colonialism, India's share in the overall global GDP comes down to 12.25%, and China goes to 17.23%. At the same time, Britain and Western Europe increases from 1.8 and 20 to 9 and 33. What's happening here is the systematic development of the West. At the same time, there's an underdevelopment in the rest. And that's kind of where I want to leave that bit of it, the development of capitalism, the small d part of it. Now on to the big D part of the picture, or post-World War II project of innovation. And here I'm going to talk about two institutions, financial institutions that were set up during that time. Firstly, the World Bank, which was then called the IBRD, or the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and the IMF. Now, these two institutions are important because they were instrumental in kind of setting up the new financial system post-World War II. This was put into place at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, just when World War II was ending. A bunch of the Allied nations, presidents got together along with their lead economists at this place, Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire, northeast part of England, and set the terms for the global economic system then. Set these two organizations, they also kind of set the base of the global economy as the US dollar at that time, and the value of the US dollar would be set to the gold standard. What that means is every dollar would be kind of backed up by the amount of physical gold held by the US at that time. One of the first few ideas of the World Bank and the US in those post-war years was the Marshall Plan in 1948. This was, remember, this is in the context of World War II. A lot of the European economies were devastated by war. And the only way they could help them redevelop is by giving a lot of aid and soft loans as part of their development goal. There were two angles to it. One was, of course, a moral perspective, is to help fellow countries in increasing their growth and development. The second was also, the more sinister one, was to develop a consumer base for US exports. And again, think of David Harvey and the Spatial Fix, the need for capital to always look for new spaces to expand. A graph basically shows you how much money went into 15 different countries in Europe. $12 billion was spent. A lot of that went to the UK, Italy, Netherlands, West Germany, France, etc., etc. This was also the time when the two superpowers emerging after World War II, USA and USSR, were going in two opposite different directions from a political economic standpoint. This was the time of the Cold War, where the US was propagating a certain capitalist agenda, and the USSR was promoting a more statist communist agenda, or a socialist state which would control resources, etc., etc. Remember, and this was also the time when the third world was just taking place. So you had the first world, which was the US, the second world, which was USSR, and the third world, which is newly decolonizing countries in India, I mean, much like India, like the ones in sub-Saharan Africa, like the ones in Southeast Asia. And the idea was that since the World Bank and the IMF were done with the Marshall Plan and redeveloping Europe, their economies were up and running. Now the time was to use that money that was there, the loans, the soft aid, etc., in the third world countries. Again, there were two ideas here. One is to stop the spread of communism. And remember, this was also the time of the Vietnam War and the Korean Wars, and also communist activity in Cambodia, Laos, Afghanistan. So there was a geopolitical angle to why loans were being given out by the World Bank. There was also the idea of maintaining access to foreign markets for US products. So there was also an economic angle there. And on a side note, this was also when there was a radical idea called the non-aligned movement also came into place, where India, along with other countries, decided they were not going to be a pawn in this geopolitical game. They would go along in their own kind of route to development without falling for either of those ideologies. But if you look at some of the reasons for the development mindset, it's rather simple. So this is Rostov's 5 stages of growth. So Rostov was an American economist who basically aptly dubbed his book a non-communist manifesto in 1960s. His argument was such that every economy or every country in the world goes through 5 stages of growth. You start off with a traditional society, which a lot of places like India and parts in Africa were. You then go to a stage of preconditions for takeoff. So you go from a stage of limited technology, you go to a place where agriculture, you can expand on that. You then go to takeoff where you develop some kind of manufacturing base. You then go to a drive to maturity, which you go into more service-based industries, and then you reach the US level of high mass consumption, or the Western model of growth. This was the kind of stuff that was being promoted under the guise of development. Basically, if you want to catch up with the West, this is the stuff you need to follow. And this also played out in terms of economic activities. So there were primary economic activities, stuff like agriculture, mining, natural resource management, etc. Thereafter, if you want to move up in the ladder, you go to a secondary economic activity, you start doing manufacturing, construction, etc., etc. And thereafter, you go to tertiary economic activities, so services, different kinds of banking, transport, health, all the white-collar jobs. And right now, there's even a 4th category coming in, the quaternary sector, which is basically, if you think of Wall Street, the high banking finance world, if you think of Silicon Valley, the AI developed Silicon Valley kind of environment, those are the quaternary sectors which countries are being kind of forced to look at in terms of where to go next. And this was also what Joseph Stiglitz recently pointed out about what Kerala to do. He's a former World Bank economist and also later turned World Bank critic. Advised the Kerala government to diversify some of its economic inputs, move away from Gulf remittances as well, so that you can start looking at some of these higher level economic activities. And many countries like India did go for it, right? In the post-independence period, particularly in India, 1950s, 60s, the socialist state, Nehru's social state, a lot of this economic development went into infrastructure development, rural development. The idea was to maximize your agricultural resources, your mining resources. So we built dams, canals, They were called temples of modern India, famously by Nehru, the Bakranangal Dam. The photo on the right side is the Green Revolution. Engineers came in actually from University of Wisconsin. Madison was a great place where a lot of engineers who worked on high yield variety of crops, fertilizers, came into India telling us how to kind of take care of our food scarcity, grow better, more high producing wheat, rice, etc. But unfortunately, space and time don't work in that linear way which Rostov wanted people to think. There were a bunch of things that happened in the 1970s which really wreaked havoc with many of the third world countries. One was Nixon's termination of the gold standard in 1971. This was, remember, the US dollar until now was pegged to the gold. So whatever happened, no one could print more amounts of US dollars. That would just lead to inflation. But the moment President Nixon decided to get rid of the gold standard, you could print as many notes as you want, and thereafter the US became just like the US dollar became just like any other commodity. You could trade it freely on the global market. 1973, there was the oil crisis. OPEC countries in West Asia decided to form a cartel so that they could increase the price of oil. A lot of the money that was generated there was then pumped into London banks, who also, many commercial banks in London like Barclays, started lending to third world countries. Thought of it as a good financial move in terms of, who would have thought that a country would go bankrupt? You can always lend money then, that's a profitable business. Thereafter, the US by 1979 is going through a case of both stagnation in the economy as well as high inflation, or what they call stagflation, as economists like to call it. Paul Volcker comes in as the Federal Bank Reserve head, and he introduces the Volcker shock. Basically, he increases the rates of all the money that's federal bonds. So a lot of US dollars, again, goes back into the US economy. So a lot of basically push and pull factors happening in the global scale. In other words, what happened in a very simple way is the value of the US dollar shot up. And since many of third world countries like India, Mexico, and parts of Africa had borrowed from the World Bank and commercial banks in dollars, they also had to pay back in dollars. And that became almost impossible. You have the debt crisis taking place. The first country to default on its loans, 1981, Mexico. No one thought that could happen. But that did happen, and then there was a cascading series of effects. It was just impossible to pay back loans. Countries were spending just money on paying back loans as opposed to spending it on health, education, etc., etc. The IMF then comes in with structural adjustment programs, and these are a couple of caricatures about how it's been viewed in the third world. Particularly, structural adjustment programs were IMF stabilization programs, where they went into countries and said, look, you have a deficit problem. The only way to deal with that is through austerity. Cut back on public expenditures, cut back on good state goods, and open up your economy, allow private growth to happen, and allow foreign investors to come in. People have called this a new form of imperialism, a new form of colonialism, like you see in the cartoons here. Basically, what all of this is doing in a short period of time is there's already been a divide in the world. Previously, it was called the colonized, the colonizers. During the Cold War, it's called the First World, Second World, Third World. Later, during the World Bank, called it developing countries, developed countries, underdeveloped countries. Now, the new lexicon is the global north and the global south, because most of the countries, barring Australia, who have a high GDP, are in the northern part of the globe, if you look at it from that perspective. This is also the time when neoliberalism as an economic ideology takes root. 1980s is the time when Reaganism and Thatcherism takes place in the US and the UK. And particularly a couple of economists, Hayek and Milton Friedman, both based at the University of Chicago, decide that this is a good way of kind of maximizing your growth, right? Open up all your economies. And it was built on, the reason it's called neoliberalism, it was built on some of the classical work of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who were writing way back into the 1700s. It was called the Washington Consensus, a set of 10 postulates that every country must follow. This was set up by the World Bank, the IMF, and the US Department of Treasury. All of them headquartered in Washington, hence the moniker Washington Consensus. What did it entail? Fiscal discipline, public expenditure priorities, tax reform, financial liberalization, exchange rates, trade liberalization, foreign direct investment, privatization, deregulation, and property rights. Basically, opening up of your economy, reducing state control, and allowing private enterprise to thrive. Dr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister in 1991, and faced with the mounting challenge of having to repay its huge debts. Remember, India had also taken loans from the World Bank to build a lot of infrastructure projects. At that time, along with the VP Narasimha Rao government, they decided that the best way to kind of get out of this conundrum is to open up the economy. So that's when the liberalization of the economy happened. And thereafter, the story is pretty much known. I think everyone is old enough in this room to realize what's happened in the last 30 years in terms of high growth. No doubt, India's GDP expanded like crazy during that time, right? And it didn't matter which government was in power, whether left wing, right wing, center, it didn't really matter. There was an economic policy. The shift had taken place in 91, and 30 years we've been kind of riding that wave, the tiger of new India, as some people like to call it. So what started off in 1991 as 1% growth soon went up to 4, 6, 7, 8, sometimes even 10. And we've been kind of infatuated with this whole GDP growth, right? Every time you open up the Financial Express, that's what India's GDP is at so and so. You open up on the news channels, that's what people are talking about. One just needs to look at the graph. Yes, it's incredible. There's been growth from all sectors, and everything has been really booming in that sense. And India has been slowly been able to rise up from the lesser developed or underdeveloped countries, which large parts of Africa still are, and move into the middle economies. They're still not at the level of, say, US or Western Europe, but right there, some of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are kind of getting into the middle income countries' growth. This has also coincided with, remember that whole idea of as your economy rises, agricultural output will also go down and your services output will also grow. So this graph also shows you a lot of young Indians not getting into traditional occupations like agriculture, but more going into white-collar service professions like I did. This is also the time when urban development becomes the main focus. Until now, the focus development included economic development, yes, but focus on your rural areas. Focus on infrastructure there, but right now it's all about urban development. And there's a reason for this. Because according to this graph right now, these are the spreads of urban populations in the world. I mean, as you can see, in North America, Australia, all the rich countries are primarily urban populations, right? More than 70-80% of urban populations. India is not there yet. China is also not there yet, getting there. But as the UN notes, by 2050, 2/3 of the world's population will live in urban spaces. That means 2.5 billion people in the next 30 years will be added to urban spaces in the world. This is not distributed equitably. It's not that the US is going to have this urban population. 90% of this growth will happen in countries in Asia and Africa. And just 3 countries, India, China, and Nigeria, will account for 1/3 of that growth. So just look at the pink symbols are the new megacities, and megacities populations of more than 10 million people that will come up the next 30 years. And most of these are in South Asia, some in Africa, some in Southeast Asia. This also shows in the shift, which until now, primarily the world has been a rural population, but that's slowly shifting to an urban population. India's pace of urbanization also matches that. Right now, 2020, where urban population is roughly half of our rural population, that quickly is supposed to shift in the next 30 years. Buoyed by these projections, the Indian government has also been spending a lot in urban development projects, right? The Smart Cities mission, Kochi is of course a beneficiary of the same, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. I mean, the map on the left shows you just a sense of 20 cities that are more than 2 million population. Some of them are big cities like Bombay, Delhi, but others are smaller tier 2 cities which are really supposed to be the engines of the economy. Places like Kochi, places like Lucknow, places like Bhubaneswar, these are supposed to be where the new urban population will come, young millennials will come and settle down. These will drive economic growth. That's what at least everyone is hoping that is going to happen in the next 30 years. And hence you also have formations of various parastatal organizations like the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Authority or the Greater Cochin Development Authority, all of these authorities kind of working directly under the executive branch of the government, for trying to welcome foreign capital, foreign investment, trying to make sure that infrastructure development and growth, as you can see from the recent budget that was released by the central government, a lot of emphasis on infrastructure, a lot of emphasis on infrastructure in Kerala as well, with elections just coming up. But there are two challenges to this idea of endless economic growth. And I just want to introduce two concepts here. One is the idea of the Anthropocene, and the second is the idea of uneven development. Now, the Anthropocene is a unique concept. It was proposed by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer in 2000. Both of them are soil scientists based in the US. What they noted that growth in human population, growth in consumption and cattle population, rapid urbanization is leading to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, methane. This was for the first time scientists could actually measure stratigraphic material like rocks, sediments, and glaciers to notice a change in the Earth's composition of these materials. And this, they argue, that this due to the effects of human activities on geology and ecology, our current geological epoch will be called the Anthropocene. So this is a new term for this time frame of the Earth, right? There are different time frames. The Holocene was there before the Anthropocene. And this is particularly right now, this age of humans is being called the Anthropocene by actual scientists. When did it start? Well, I think there are different arguments for when it started. Some say it started with nuclear bombs in Fukushima and Nagasaki in 1940s. Others argue that no, this was during high point of industrial capitalism in England in the 1800s. Still others are saying that no, you have to go back to plantation economies in the US in the 1500s. That's when we started really altering the shape of the earth and the quality of the earth. But the effects of the climate change are there to see. I don't need to lecture anyone about what happened in Kerala in 2018 and 2019, or what happened in Uttarakhand in 2021. And of course, East Africa in 2018. These are just some examples, and most of these are water-related issues as well. As cities, as human beings, we've always kind of lived along water, and these are also some of the places that are the most vulnerable to water-related externalities and calamities. And again, focus on the map here. If you remember, some of the most polluting places on the earth were located beyond the tropics, the US, Australia, Europe, while some of the most vulnerable places are those within the tropics, places in South Asia, places in Sub-Saharan Africa, places in Southeast Asia. That brings us to a much larger question about environmental justice and political ecology. Because what's at stake here is something different. It's the fact that those countries in the world are polluting the most for whatever reason, whether it's high economic growth, high consumption, a quality of life that none of us can imagine. They are not the ones who are facing the brunt of some of these externalities. It's our people, our brothers, sisters, our cousins in the developing countries of the world who are facing most of the environmental calamities. And it's about understanding the structural causes that produce these issues, where water scarcity is not merely a natural problem, but it's deeply political. It's not about just ecology, it's about political ecology. The second concept is of uneven development, and again, introduced by critical geographer Neil Smith in 1984, basically again looks at, remember, capital, and in this whole era of free markets, capital can move anywhere in the world, wherever it finds profits. But the moment it finds profit, it will stay in a place and it can really change a place. But the moment it doesn't find capital can also, it's flexible enough to go into some other place. But unfortunately, people living there don't have that same, the privilege to move around. Basically, that means that there are physical boundaries that stop people from moving places of less development to more development. And some of the stark examples of that are found in our built environment. The picture from Sao Paulo in Brazil shows you how swimming pools are existing at the same time with informal settlements, in a mere wall separating some of these bodies. On the bottom, one of my favorite pictures, this is actually Hiranandani Gardens in Powai in Mumbai, a place where I was born and raised. The right side is the residential complex, actually designed by Hafiz Contractor, one of India's foremost architects. And the left side is informal settlements, all of it divided by this natural hillside, which is thousands of years old. It's an old basalt rock, volcanic rock there. A lot of the service people who come to work on the right come from the left. So your maids, your drivers, your cleaners, etc., etc. The interesting thing is that the right side development all of it is illegal. It was supposed to be land earmarked for LIG and MIG, low-income group housing. So a lot of the people on the left were actually supposed to live on the right, but that never happened. You can take a guess which part of that mountain I came from. Another classic example of inequality in the built environment, often touted as the biggest single-house family residence of one of the richest people in the world. But just a few kilometers north, you also have Dharavi, and Dharavi is just one famous example. As I mentioned before, more than 60% of Mumbai is informal settlements. And like the famous meme goes, "Ye Mumbai hai, ये विदर्भा है और यहाँ पे पहाड़ी हो रही है." So this is a photo of a rain dance in Mumbai. Holi, which is next weekend from now, is celebrated across by many North Indian communities. Part of that is you have a bunch of water fountains on top. This happens in my housing society as well. A lot of people get drunk below that and dance in the rain. And as you know, most of the water is not coming through piped water supply. All of this is coming through illegal water tankers from some of the more rural parts of Maharashtra, particularly Vidarbha. So you're directly connected. Inequality in water exists at that direct level. You're sucking out water, depleting groundwater levels so that you can have this kind of enjoyment here. I'm going to start wrapping up my talk because it might have got a bit too heavy for the audience here. So what do we think of solutions? And solutions is such a wonderful game, right? I'm sure there are a lot of architects and engineers. I think that I spoke to a few of them before. But we love to think of engineering or designing solutions to change the world. We really enjoy that. And real-world social problems, we think we can change them by tweaking, maintaining, or designing better systems. And the primary kind of critique that people say that, look, India's population is huge, right? What are we, 1.45 billion, almost there? What are we going to do? Where are we going to get? Water is just one example of it, but where are we going to get resources for so many millions, crores of people, hundreds of crores of people? Well, this argument, unfortunately, is very neo-Malthusian, and I use Thomas Malthus as a crux here. He was writing in 1798. Particularly, he's a British economist, and he noted that in his graph, he noticed this point called the Malthusian Catastrophe. Basically, he noted that production of food, or the amount of food in the world, increases in a linear way, but population explodes, goes in an exponential way. There comes a point which is called the Malthusian Catastrophe, where your population far exceeds your food production. That's when he says that's when the world really runs into problem. And that's when wars happen, famine happens, various other kinds of social natural disaster happens. And he says that's the great thing because, all these people are expendable. You get rid of this excess population and then we're back to normal. Then you can start controlling your population and your production of food. So this argument of too much population, where many of us really give a lot of times, doesn't hold forth. It's been critiqued by critical thinkers and it doesn't work out in that way. What other solutions might exist? Well, there are some techno-managerial solutions like geoengineering or eco-modernism. Basically, the idea is that let's engineer our way out of some of these real-world issues. So if there's a problem of water scarcity, why not build a big mega dam which might help us in kind of restoring some of that groundwater? Or let's put some aerosols, reflective aerosols in the air that might capture some of the rainwater and then give us some more rain in some of the months. Fortunately, that logic also seems rather circular because weren't some of these big technologies responsible for the ecological catastrophe that we are in right now? So the idea that you can solve an ecological catastrophe with a large technological innovation seems a bit misplaced. The other idea is that of leaving it all to markets, right? If there's a problem of scarcity, let's leave it to the market. The market is the best, the most efficient way of managing your natural resources. So here we have new financial derivatives being constructed so that people can speculate and hedge on markets and on water resources. But if anything we've learned over the last 30 years is financial crises like 2008, like the one that just happened because of COVID-19, like the one that took place in Southeast Asia in the 1990s, all of it that also because of the increasing marketization of everyday life, the increasing financialization of everyday life. Markets are useful, yes. Doesn't mean that you start using it to kind of take care of all social parts of life, right? And water being a basic resource, it makes it difficult to justify that. And of course, the last idea there of solution is just growth. Let's keep growing. Look, we're a poor country, yes. I've listed out the reasons for that. So let's just get enough growth happening, and eventually some of it, like droplets of water, will trickle down into, the bowls of the needy and the bottom. Unfortunately, again, that doesn't seem to work because a lot of it is siphoned off, tax money siphoned off to tax havens. A lot of our billionaires are also taking away public money and running away from the country, as you already know. And so what's the problem if we are really, and this graph really shows you, in terms of human growth, everyone in this world, we haven't been richer. Like in the history of civilization, right now in the 21st century, human beings have never had access to this kind of material wealth, which is a fact. So what is the problem then? Why are we all cribbing about development and economic growth? The problem, Branko Milanovic, a recent economist, would say is the elephant curve, right? Or the idea that global inequality exists in economic growth. Yes, we have wealth like never before in the history of time, but percentiles A and percentiles C will show that most of this wealth is concentrated in just a creamy layer of society. The 1%, definitely, but also the top 20, 30, 40%, the upper middle class, as I'd like to call it, of the people. And the most people in the lower rungs of society in the economic ladder are losing out in the process. Just look at India's example here as well. The amount of wealth, portion of the GDP controlled by the top 1%, the top 5%, the top 10%, and then look at the next 30%, look at the last 60% after that. So, where does that leave us? If all the growth in the world and India is being driven not by trickle-down effect, then what is it being driven by? I argue here that it's being driven by people in informal settlements who are the drivers of the economy, right? And here it's useful to think with Abdul Malik Simon, who's a post-colonial theorist based at the University of Sheffield. He calls this concept people as infrastructure. What basically he's saying is that in large parts of the world, which is huge parts, we're talking about 60 to 70% of the world's population living in informal settlements in Africa, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, where don't have access to public resources, public services, most people themselves become infrastructure. For example, in this case of a Delhi slum, Yafa, True Love, another scholar notes that women become the infrastructures. They're the ones who take every morning, go out with their blue can, go to the nearby tanker, stand in line for hours, and then get that water back, and that's how they run their economy. These are the same people then who come and work. They reproduce the household, and the same people come and work for us as drivers, maids, etc., all our lower level, service level economy. Or this concept of jugaad, and my spouse Deepika would really hate me using this term, but jugaad is also this term which Indians love to use, right? Oh yeah, every Indian is such a jugaadu. Especially in the city of Bombay, oh yeah, this guy is doing jugaad, this guy is doing jugaad. It's touted by our billionaires as well, from Ratan Tata to Anand Mahindra. But again, 20, 30 years of research by social scientists on what jugaad really means is, jugaad is a form of subsistence strategy. It's not some romantic ideal of an inbuilt entrepreneur or businessman that we Indians naturally have. It's a way in which people, informal people, kind of live and make do with what they don't have. And then this again is showed by Nikhil Anand in his book Hydraulic City, how he talks about how when water is not available in some of these informal settlements, people actually go to their BMC corporators and try to beg them to give them water. And that goes along caste lines, that goes along religious lines. Only if you belong to a certain caste or religious background will you get water, etc. So most of these ways in which people as infrastructure work end up reproducing inequalities based on caste, class, gender, race, etc. So then the solution is certainly not GDP growth or not techno-management. It's more socio-political, right? And going ahead with grassroots level organizations, democratic institutions, progressive politics, equity, making sure everyone is part of those decision-making processes, and then figuring out what to do there. And yes, GDP growth is useful and techno-management is useful, but only if it's paired along with each of these. Finally, it's been exactly a year since the national government started a mandated nationwide lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And on the 1-year anniversary, as most of us in this room have kind of become used to working at home, sitting comfortably and working with our glass of water. We are celebrating going back to normal, vaccines are around the corner, cases are also somehow manageable. Let's spare thought for all those people who run our economies, again, all the migrant laborers who didn't have the luxury to work from home, they rather had to work from home. And hundreds, if not more, were killed in road accidents with parched throats while trying to traverse back home to their home states in the complete absence of transportation services. So I ask you, what is this normal that we're going back to? What is this normal that we're celebrating going back to? If the normal is this scene right here, two sets of scenes, then I would finally conclude my talk by saying that disenfranchised, dispossessed, marginalized, and oppressed peoples of the world, not only in India, across the world, have been living in a catastrophe throughout their lives, some intergenerationally, right? It wasn't called COVID-19, it was called something else. Tomorrow it might be something else, but this is going to carry on. And if that's the normal that we're going back to, I would rather not go back to it. My name is Siddharth. Thank you very much.
What a gripping, interesting journey down the annals of world history and economy. Thank you, sir, for that informative, educative, enlightening words. We are super impressed. So is nature, as we received some good showers outside. Ladies and gentlemen, now we move on to the next session, the interactive session. The members of the audience can raise their hands. Our volunteers will come to you. You can introduce yourself and raise questions.
This is always the fun part.
Hello, Siddharth. I'm Sunny George. I'm in charge of the CMS Water Institute. I had been to your university a few years back, and in our conversation I told you, you also face the same problem, I think. From my discussions at the university, you also face the same problems, like, in Wisconsin, a lot of people, just because of the most attractive resource you have is water. 20% of the world's fresh water is right there, and enormous, very rich people from Germany and all that came for breweries and all that. That was a big problem there, and you solved the problem. So I think technology is a solution for that, because technology was very effectively used by you. Yeah, and that was the solution to a certain extent. So if there is a good policy, definitely you can attract good technology and solve the problem. What do you feel about that?
Thank you. Thank you for your point. Yes, I think technology definitely helps, but I think what I'm trying to make a point is it's not the only solution. We need to look at progressive policies. And the reason the US is different in that sense, and particularly the Midwest, remember the Midwest, where Wisconsin is located, where the Great Lakes are located, and where Sir rightly noted is 20% of freshwater resources are located. It was also the epicenter of Fordism in the US. This is where Ford set up his factories in Detroit. lot of growth happened there. So we're talking about completely different levels of growth, completely different levels in the 1960s GDP that was made. So resources that we cannot compete with at this time. So, and a lot of the land in the US was also taken away from some of the indigenous residents there. So yes, technology is useful, but it has its limitations. It has to be teamed up with progressive politics.
So I have just one question. Yeah. How effective is conversion of seawater to potable water as a solution for water scarcity? We have been reading about that for some time.
Yeah, I wouldn't comment on something that I'm not particularly familiar with. But again, I think the main takeaway from this lecture would be that technology is useful, so we can think of that, but what happens after? Okay, assume that we've got this technology that we can convert seawater into fresh water, all of us can drink with it, all of us can dance with it at Holi next weekend. My point is this, what happens after that, right? We've seen, and this is not a critique of it, the idea is that we've got the most resources that we've ever had as a collective of humans. Why is it still that we have problems of inequality? Why is it still that we have those images of inequality where some people have so much more and some people have so less? So I don't think you can create as much as technology, and I'm all for techno-management. I respect engineers who do that kind of work, all for you. I'm full power to you. But my point is this, if you don't look at the larger political economic system of what it is doing or what that technology is being used for, you're not going to solve anything. You might convert salt water into fresh water, but if that's just going into make more swimming pools, more gated communities, more water parks, that's really not helping you solve inequality, right? That's not going to the informal user there. So that's kind of the argument there.
Okay, thank you, sir. On a lighter note, just out of curiosity, which part of Hiranandani Hills are you from?
Well, my well-fed appearance would clearly say that I'm from the right part of it, the one designed by Hafiz Contractor, the one that is made of Greek and Roman columns and loved by architects across the world.
Thank you very much, sir. As a token of our deep respect and heartfelt gratitude to the distinguished speaker, may I now invite Professor Pramod Tevanur, Vice Chairman of SEMS Group of Institutions, to hand over a memento to architect Siddharth Menon. Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a big round of applause? Thank you very much, sirs. Dear dignitaries and guests, now as we approach the conclusion of the 18th edition of Triannual Lecture Series Beyond Square Feet conducted by Asset Homes on this World Water Day, let me thank you one and all for honoring us with our presence, triggering positive interactions and introspections, as well as supporting us in this venture together to do our bit to save, conserve and provide water for all. Let me take this opportunity to thank personally and on behalf of Asset Homes and SEMS, architect Siddharth Menon, for taking time out from his busy schedule to be here with us today and be a source of inspiration to us. So with this deliberation exchange of ideas, we mark the close of today's events. Thank you for your valuable presence, ladies and gentlemen. Good night till we meet again.